For another wonderful joint office webinar. Happy Tuesday. Today we are going to discover the National Zero-Emission Freight Corridor Strategy. I know that this is a very exciting topic. I think one that we've been wanting to put out there for a while, so I know I'm excited to learn from today's panelists. Just wanted to cover a couple of housekeeping items. So for Zoom, the controls are located at the bottom of your screen, and if they're not appearing, you can feel free to toggle your cursor to the bottom edge, and you should see them pop up. We are going to be using what is known as, we call the Q&A window. So instead of the chat, we use this Q&A function. So this allows you to submit questions and actually let the panelists answer you directly, keeps them nice and organized. So thank you so much for thinking of your great questions and submitting them there. As a disclaimer, this webinar is being recorded and we will be posting it on the Joint Office website or potentially using it internally. And if you speak during the webinar or use video, you are presumed to consent to recording and use of your voice or image. This webinar will be posted and the slides will also be posted on the Joint Office website in the coming days following. So if you do want to refer back to it or use it as a future resource, we do hope you do so. So just in terms of an agenda, we're going to have a nice bit of introduction from the Joint Office. We'll have some polling questions, and then we're going to really go into some great presentations from our panelists and leave time for audience Q&A. So thank you again for using that Q&A function for submitting questions throughout today's webinar. These are our wonderful panelists who are joining us from across the federal government. So we have Kevin George Miller from the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, Jean Chu, who is working with the Joint Office as well. We also have Alicia Gildy from the Vehicle Technologies Office at Department of Energy, as well as Michael Laughlin. And then we are joined by Ben Gould from the Hydrogen Technologies Office at the Department of Energy. So I'll let the speakers talk a little bit more about who they are and what they do. But in the meantime, I'm going to dive into our first polling question. So Haley, if you wouldn't mind launching that one, thank you. So this one is what region of the country you are from. So if you wouldn't mind selecting the best fit for you, wherever you are, we appreciate it. Wonderful. Looks like we have just reached a good critical mass. Awesome. Thanks, Haley. So yeah, it looks like we've got a good representation from the Northeast today, followed by the upper Midwest, and great representation from across the country. So thank you all so much for joining us. Awesome. So we'll go to our next polling question. Sorry, just slid through all the slides. So the next question is, what sector are you coming from? So once again, if you can find the response that best suits you, that would be wonderful. I was like watching the polling questions come in. Okay, looks like a good critical mass, Haley. Thank you. Wonderful. So it looks like we've got folks coming in from across different types of government as well as non-government public sectors. So thank you all so much for being here today. It's wonderful to have you. All right. Well, the polling is complete. We can now get into the meat of our presentation. So I will pass it along for Kevin Miller and Jean Chu from the Joint Office to dive into their presentation.
Hi there, I'm Kevin Miller. I'm a senior advisor with the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, and I'll be helping to introduce some of the topics alongside my colleague Jean Chu. Jean, do you want to introduce yourself before we get going?
Hi, this is Jean Chu. I'm with the Joint Office and as a data analyst.
All right. So if you're not familiar with the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation is a federal office established under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA, or bipartisan infrastructure law, to align the resources and expertise of the U.S. Department of Energy and the U.S. Department of Transportation. So the aim of the Joint Office is to really accelerate electrified transportation and those related systems across country to ensure that there is a convenient, reliable, affordable, and accessible network that allows everyone to ride, drive, and haul electric. Next slide, please. Although we were established as a joint office to reporting to both the Departments of Energy and Transportation, one of the key roles that the Joint Office serves is to provide guidance, technical assistance, and analysis across the board, both internally to support transportation electrification and zero-emission transportation programs across the federal government, as well as to providing that technical assistance to stakeholders, state and local levels, the private sector. And upon our establishment, the 4 big bipartisan infrastructure law programs that we focused on were the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, the Charging, Fueling, and Infrastructure Program, both of those at USDOT, as well as the Low-No Emission Grants Program for Transit, an FTA at DOT, and the Clean School Bus Program at EPA. As we see overlaps between, the energy and transportation world, it really has been an honor and a pleasure for our office to serve as some of that connective tissue to ensure that we can achieve the goals of these programs and that we can do even better in pursuing the goals for these respective federal cabinet level agencies. One key piece to point out that may be specifically germane and of interest to this group is a Clean Bus Planning Awards program. So in the vein of the technical assistance that's provided by the Joint Office and the National Renewable Energy Labs have provided an opportunity for comprehensive and bespoke planning and support for fleet electrification, specifically for fleets eligible for FTA's low or no emission grant program, with some exceptions that you can dig into on our website. So click on the link when you see these slides, take a snapshot, use the QR code. This is just one of the ways in which we're trying to provide technical assistance to help folks with the transition to zero emission fleets and to decarbonize the transportation sector. Slide, please. If you're interested in any other kinds of assistance, please don't be shy. That's one of the main driving forces for our existence. So going to driveelectric.gov/contract contact is a way to ensure that your question gets to our teams and that we can provide you resources. And if you want to make sure you don't miss out on upcoming news, developments, and opportunities related to not only the Joint Office, but across government, across the market, please go to driveelectric.gov/subscribe. So with that preamble out of the way, we're going to dig into some of the really exciting topics at hand, the zero emission freight corridor strategy. So we all are well aware, and if you're logging into this webinar, you probably are specifically as well, that transportation is broadly the largest sector for emissions, 33% of all U.S. emissions. And when we think about medium duty and heavy duty trucks, they account for just 5% of the miles traveled, but 20% of transportation emissions. So in thinking about what the Biden administration's goals have been, promoting at least 30% zero emission medium and heavy duty vehicle sales by 2030, 100% by 2040, and a 2050 target of zero emissions economy wide, we identified a key goal related to the freight system. And on March 12th, Joint Office published the National Zero Emission Freight Corridor Strategy, which was a collaborative effort, U.S. Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, Environmental Protection Agencies, offices within all of those umbrellas, and it was a true collaborative effort. And it really is part of the reason for the Joint Office's existing. How do we convene and coalesce around win-win-win solutions in a way that's iterative and future-proofed to help make sure we're learning from the private sector and government innovations and approaches. The intent is really to meet, if we could stay back on that last slide real quick, the intent is really to make sure that we're aligning and accelerating cross-sector investments across the board to provide one consistent tool to help not only federal, but state, local, other funding agencies help ascribe prioritizations for funding to decarbonize the freight sector and to support the transition to zero-emission fuel types, meeting the market where it is, and to do so in a way that also clearly signals to zero-emission fuel markets that work on the fuel supply side similarly needs to take place. So how can we help signal the vision for a comprehensive approach to accelerate a world-class zero-emission freight network? How do we unlock investments across the board? And how do we make sure that we're meeting freight truck and technology markets where they are today, where they're likely to develop? And how do we establish a clear national vision for an all-of-government approach? So the process, the next slide, please. The process that we took was truly collaborative, convening cabinet level secretariats, their respective offices, create that national strategy, identify the key characteristics of zero-emission freight corridors for electric charging and hydrogen fueling infrastructure, prioritize and strategically sequence federal investments. So how do we think about what's necessary and what would be the ways to prioritize investments that meet the market where it is by starting in regions that are going to experience success early, determining where they're likely to develop next, and then how do we unpack that by identifying key deployment factors in a phased approach that can achieve those goals in a way that, again, meets the markets where they are and helps set realistic but ambitious challenges to continue to evolve and develop. So in the next slide, we will take a peek at our approach. So in order to catalyze that investment to not only meet the market where it is, but to help encourage it to develop in a sustainable, scalable, and rapid fashion, our approach was, which Gene will explain in just a moment, was to determine what are the consistent deployment factors or metrics that we can use to characterize where and when investments can and should be made to reflect the freight activity that's taking place, the economic considerations, the equity considerations, and otherwise. So we then applied those factors to a map to create our cadence and approach for investment. And the intended goal is to make sure that we provide a tool that can be leveraged by funding agencies of all types to prioritize investments in places where the investments can be most used and useful now and help also catalyze investments everywhere. Also, how do we make sure that that can be interpreted and received as a signal by utilities, regulators, zero-emission fuel providers to plan for, approve, and undertake zero-emission fuel infrastructure investments, and to provide one consistent approach to align policy across jurisdictions. And this is not a one-and-done approach. Our intention was to create a living process, to create a living document that can be updated and reflected over time to respond to developments in the market as they happen. And we took that approach out of humility, knowing that we don't always get things perfectly right the first time. And this webinar is just one more step in the process to ensure that we've got an ongoing dialogue and we're engaging with folks. And some of the other panelists will talk about how we're doing that. So at this point, I'd love to hand it over to Gene to explain a little bit more about what our process was, what our approach was, how we did our analysis to help explain the results and the maps that are currently published and that my colleagues will subsequently explain. Gene?
Thanks, Kevin. So, so to look at what kind of deployment factor we use to develop this zero-emission freight corridor strategy. So the strategy is based on the National Highway Freight Network. So that's our bone to the national network for freight movement. And then we also consider the important facilities, locations for freight movement, that including the seaports and inland ports with the higher throughput, and then also the intermodal freight facilities. And in the later phases, we also considered truck service and parking locations that will enable long distance travel across the country from different regions. And to further prioritize those facilities, we look into areas that has environmental and air quality concerns, using EPA's non-attainment area as one data point we're using to look into locations that would highly benefit from the clean truck and low carbon mid and heavy duty vehicles. And from the early phases, we also look into the factors that will enable the early deployment of zero-emission truck and vehicles. So that including state policies that particularly look into early deployment and enabled those zero-emission trucks. And we also look into projections of areas, locations that will potentially have better total cost of ownership to allow zero-emission vehicles for mid and heavy duty trucks compared to internal combustion engines. And also in early phase, we consider pilot project, demonstration through DOE's zero-emission vehicle corridor planning grants. And so that allowed us to prioritize and select facilities and hubs through different phases by gradually relax some of those criteria here, and then look into the freight network to select high truck travel corridors when we move from phase 1 to phase 4. So that's the general approach, how we select those corridors and hubs and facilities that we think will be important for the deployment of zero-emission freight vehicles. And I'll pass this to Michael Laughlin to explain the maps and phases.
Yep. Thanks very much, Jean. Michael Laughlin, I'm part of the Vehicle Technologies Office here at the U.S. Department of Energy's Vehicle Technology, and part of the Vehicle Technologies Office, part of our outreach, education, and deployment for VTO. I want to especially thank the Clean Cities and Communities directors that I see on screen who are joining us today. We're really glad you're able to join us. So the strategy aims to facilitate ubiquitous and convenient access to EV charging and hydrogen refueling along our nation's freight corridors and at local freight ecosystems. The 4-phase progression will support building out America's zero-emission freight system as needed today and where it will be needed over time. It accelerates adoption of zero-emission trucks by initially focusing on key freight hubs with around 100-mile radius in phase 1, moving toward building out a complete zero-emission freight network in phase 4 by 2040. The strategy identifies the greatest opportunities to support early introduction of zero-emission trucks to promote cost savings for commercial fleets, cleaner air for communities, and strategic investments for infrastructure companies and electric utilities. It builds on what's working, starting where zero-emission vehicle enabling policies, industry, and fleets are focused and scaling up around the nation. Clearly signaling freight needs through 2040 will support local, state, and regional planning and investment that will be needed to ensure availability of electricity and hydrogen as zero-emission fuels. And I'll talk more about the specifics of each phase as I show the maps next. If you can go to the next one, please. Phase 1 establishes priority hubs based on freight volume. This phase represents early deployment of zero-emission vehicles in areas where they're most likely to succeed in the near term. Deployment factors in this phase considered the most heavily used freight corridor segments by freight volume within the National Highway Freight Network. In this phase, we're looking at the top 25% of those network roads. Also included were the most used ports by freight tonnage, the top 20% of ports in this phase, and supporting facilities within 100 miles of those ports. In addition, EPA non-attainment areas and state policies that enable zero-emission vehicle deployments were considered in this phase. The main adopters of zero-emission trucks in this phase are first mover fleets and those with return to base operations. Battery electric vehicles are dominant in this phase. During this time, considerable federal funding is being invested overall in zero-emission infrastructure through NEVI, clean ports, and other avenues, and hydrogen hub projects, which we'll be talking about a little bit later today, are getting underway as well. All of this results in the map you see here with key hubs developing along Interstate 5, Interstate 10, I-80, segments of I-95, and the Texas Triangle cities. For scale, this represents about 12,000 miles of the National Highway Freight Network, or about 23% of that network. Next, please. Phase 2 begins the process of connecting these hubs of activity along critical freight corridors. As with phase one, deployment factors include the top 25% of the freight corridor segments, the top 20% of ports, and EPA non-attainment areas. In phase two, we expand the strategy beyond the states that have adopted California's advanced clean truck rule or taken other proactive steps to plan for ZEV corridors. Truck technology is evolving and electric truck ranges are likely to be increasing, so regional and long-haul freight opportunities are starting in this phase. Battery electric trucks are still dominant, but hydrogen fuel cell vehicles are also coming online at this time. In this phase, the Memorandum of Understanding associated with the Global Commercial Vehicle Drive to Zero initiative is looking at a 2030 target of 30% zero-emission vehicle sales in medium and heavy-duty trucks, and the EPA greenhouse gas emission regulations for 2027 and 28 are also having an effect on zero-emission vehicle availability. And here, hydrogen hub construction is ramping up. We're seeing connections along the interstate highways where much of freight moves, like I-95 in the east, I-5 in the west, and I-10 and I-80 across the country. Key corridors are now making connections between hubs along I-5, I-10, I-80, and the Texas Triangle, serving the West Coast ports and expanding along I-95. Phase two brings the total mileage to 19,000, or 36% of the national highway freight network. Next, please. Nope, phase three, there we go. Phase three expands the list of potential zero-emission freight hubs to a larger percentage of ports and freight facilities. Here, the top 40% of ports are prioritized to reflect the increased capacity to support point-to-point zero-emission freight transportation along all of I-80, I-95, I-10, and I-70. We're now seeing some potential for long-haul trucking with both battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell technologies. As a result, more nationwide connections are being made throughout the network, and the network in the eastern United States fills out significantly. During this phase, the 2032 EPA greenhouse gas regulations help increase the number of zero-emission trucks available. This phase covers 37,000 miles of the National Highway Freight Network, or 72%. Next, please. Phase four is the final phase of the strategy in which the vast majority of the National Highway Freight Network is prioritized to support ubiquitous access to charging and fueling across corridors both east and west and north to south. Short haul, regional haul, and long haul freight are all supported by this infrastructure that links the regional corridors into a national network. Truck parking facilities have been added to phase four as part of the universe of potential freight hubs, as these will increasingly serve zero-emission truck needs. Here, the top 50% of freight corridor segments and the top 60% of ports are prioritized. The global MOU includes a 2040 target of 100% zero-emission vehicle, medium, and heavy-duty sales. We expect the hydrogen hubs to be in full production of hydrogen by this phase as well. At this stage, about 94% of the National Highway Freight Network is covered, representing 49,000 miles. So now that you've seen all four maps and heard our methodology, if you don't see your particular location represented on the map, we're happy to gather feedback to better evolving market needs in this strategy. So looking forward to continuing that conversation. Next, please. One thing I wanted to note on behalf of VTO and the Vehicle Technologies Office is a series of 7 projects that we awarded in 2022 to conduct planning efforts for zero-emission infrastructure along key freight corridors. The award of these projects predates the development of the corridor strategy, but the freight corridors these teams identified as priorities were used as important inputs to the strategy. As the map shows, the corridors addressed by these project teams can be seen in phase one of the overall strategy, particularly the ones in the Northeast, the West Coast, and in Texas. These projects are well underway now and expect to wrap up their work in 2025 with detailed plans on potential locations for infrastructure to serve freight transportation needs along these essential corridors. For those who are interested in the status of each project and more details on what they're doing, technical presentations from our Vehicle Technologies Office annual merit review from each of these teams will be available online in the near future. Now I'll hand it off to Ben Gould from HFTO to add more details on hydrogen roles in the strategy.
Thank you, Michael. Hello, everyone. I'm Ben Gould from the Hydrogen Fuel Cell Technology Office, and my background and expertise is in transportation systems along hydrogen vehicles. Next slide, please. So when we sort of look at the role of vehicles in this network for freight, I have to start with the vehicle. And it's really an all of above approach. There are multiple solutions that are going to be needed to decarbonize commercial trucks. That's what this sort of plot shows here, is we're going to be looking at 2 foundational technologies: battery electric vehicles and hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. They both have different roles to play in this overall network. All of our analysis is bounded by data and linked with the national lab. So what you see here on the left-hand side is a TCO analysis looking at the different classes of vehicles, all the way from step vans to long-haul trucks, and where sort of the break-even points are for a battery vehicle versus a fuel cell electric vehicle in terms of total cost of ownership. The assumptions for these analyses are over there on the right. I won't belabor them, but really what drives this is there's more energy on board a hydrogen vehicle, and the more work the hydrogen vehicle has to do, the more economic it makes sense. While other vehicles that don't do as much work in a day, they favor battery electric vehicles because of the price of electricity. Next slide. So if you dig a little bit deeper into this, you can actually take the VIAS data that we have and look at where the percentile vehicle use is. And what we see is plotted here in the green dots are 50th percentile, 80th percentile, and 90th percentile use rates for different vehicles. And so you can see that different vehicles match up with different classes for different technologies. Next slide. If you layer on top of that, you can look at sort of the announced and theoretical ranges for BEV vehicles. You can see where they fit along these classes of vehicles, seeing that they land in good things like step vans, but they might be a little bit challenged in things like long haul trucking. If we layer this on top of next slide, planned and development work for fuel cell electric vehicles, we can see the fuel cell electric vehicles fit better in sort of these longer range, higher use case applications. And all of this informs our plan and our investments as a government for what we want to look at in terms of vehicle development across both Hydrogen Fuel Cell Technology Office and VTO. And if you want to know more, we've had reviews of this in our AMR, so please take a deep dive. That's 5 minutes of a 45-minute presentation. This is all going to be deployed in a transformational historic funding that was passed in the bipartisan infrastructure law for the hydrogen hubs. This is administered by our partner office and the Office of Clean Energy Demonstration. So this was $7 billion were presented to make a network of regional clean hydrogen hubs. 7 were announced, and they're undergoing negotiation at the moment. Really interesting and historic from that investment announcement is it actually garnered $50 billion of outside investment. So we're talking a very large transformational investment in terms of infrastructure and many facets of this demonstration. Just to show you, the vision of this is they're very comprehensive. They have all the way from production, storage, distribution, and use all in one, and they're rolled out in 4 phases, starting in sort of a planning phase, moving to a development phase, then construction and operation. And you can see this integrated in this photo here of we have production sites, we have vehicles transmitting, hydrogen across the road, we can take it over ships, it's multimodal, it's a really integrated plan. Now, next slide. If we see where that sits on a region, here's where the 7 hubs that were announced. We have one in the Pacific Northwest, one in California, one in Texas, one in sort of the heartland, North Dakota, Minnesota region, one in the Midwest around Chicagoland in Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, Indiana, one in the Appalachia region in West Virginia, Western Pennsylvania, and then one in the Mid-Atlantic. So these are the announced hubs. If you look at the next slide, please. Along with these hub demonstrations, we've also layered on top of that a demand side initiative that's recently been announced. This is sort of an all-star consortium led by EFI that includes S&P Global and the Intercontinental Exchange, the people who run the New York Stock Exchange. So this is meant to sort of bridge that gap to provide the demand side we need to lift off the hydrogen economy. Next slide. Inside these hubs, I said they're expansive with many, many uses, but I just want to highlight a couple of them across the hubs that are really important to the zero emission freight corridor strategy. Connective infrastructure. The majority of the hubs have hydrogen fueling stations inside them as part of the hub activities. In terms of end use, transportation also clearly is used in many of the hubs, particularly we're looking around, ports for marine and cargo handling and medium and heavy duty vehicles, around these ports, around these corridors. So the hubs will basically lay a cornerstone investment to help build this zero emission freight network that uses hydrogen. Next slide. If we overlay this on the freight mission corridor strategy, here we have plotted the individual hub states and how they line up with the data around the CFI clean corridors that have been announced. And so what you can see is, by no coincidence, we're in lockstep and well alignment with the joint office. Where our hubs lie, where the hubs are going to nucleate it for the clean corridor. So we see, a hub in Texas that's well aligned with that Texas triangle and the freight corridors there. We see a hub in California aligned with the ports around Long Beach, and Oakland there. So you can see we have connectivity through I-5, maybe even across their I-10, and in sort of that I-80 corridor across the Midwest. So this, is the backdrop that can be used to grow even further larger hydrogen networks and connect the hubs through the corridor program. Next slide. Finally, this isn't all happening in a vacuum. It's really important to have a whole of government approach. We're excited that the Department of Transit announced during their CFI grants multiple hydrogen awards. So we have plans the VTO is looking at and doing plannings along the I-10 corridor. We have the hubs being built to have production and end use. And we also have transit grants going in to put stations in the ground. So we had $70 million to put fueling stations in the Texas Triangle. We have them in Colorado, California that also align with the hub strategy. Next slide. And on top of that, there's a EPA Clean program is out there looking at $3 billion of grants to help decarbonize ports, looking at both hydrogen and battery electrification. So we're waiting those announcements. Often the ports are the terminuses of these corridors. So this all fits together in a cohesive puzzle in lockstep. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Alicia to tell you a little bit more about her effort in the Vehicle Technology Office.
Thank you so much, Ben. And hi, everyone. So great to see so many friends that are dialing in for this important webinar. And what's really special about this webinar is that the folks that were working on the development of this strategy are all represented here and presenting to you, including myself, Alicia Gildy, National Manager for Zero-Emission Vehicle Partnerships and Engagement. And I am just excited to talk to you about what is next in terms of implementation. You've heard about the goal, the mission, how the strategy was designed, all the thoughtfulness that went into being smart about how we're looking at deployment over time, how that parallels nicely with all of these other federal efforts and programs that are underway, just to make sure that we are aligning with not only where investment is happening, but where policy is happening and where we need to see technology advancing over time. So what does this mean for you? And I want to say thank you, because each of you have a critical role in helping us to advance a zero-emission commercial vehicle future, and building this zero-emission freight network is absolutely critical to that. I think what was really important as we were putting together this strategy is that we wanted to make sure that we were opportune in getting the strategy out the door so that we could be informing prioritization of our federal investments. What we wanted to show you with this slide in particular is that even with the Clean Ports program, that was the first federal grant program by which we included language that if you had a project that fell in line with phase 1 or 2 of the strategy, that there would be extra consideration given to those projects to help align with where we need to be prioritizing zero-emission freight technology, and most critically, looking at our ports, seeing that they're going to be our key deployment factor, where we know there's a lot of freight movement happening in one area, where we need to be reducing the air pollution burdens on our nearby communities, as well as looking at how we can reduce the climate impacts. So that was the first grant program that gave us an opportunity to say, this is our all-government approach, and we want to make sure that we're being smart and thoughtful about prioritizing investments. Next up, EPA also included the strategy within their Clean Heavy-Duty Vehicle program. Applications are due coming up next month, so July 25th. But we're talking about considerable amount of funding here: $3 billion for the Clean Ports program, $1 billion for the Heavy-Duty Clean Vehicle program, and now out on the streets, which is so perfect and aligns so nicely with our building out zero-emission freight hubs and building out our zero-emission freight corridors, is the Charging, Fueling, and Infrastructure Grant Program. $1.3 billion is available now, and we want to encourage our partners to be collaborating and evaluating those opportunities to build charging and hydrogen fueling projects to support the deployment of commercial zero-emission vehicles. What does this mean to you? So when we designed this strategy, we wanted to make sure that it made sense for everyone, that everyone had a role in this strategy. Whether you're federal government, state government, you can use this strategy to help prioritize your investment, your planning and deployment in terms of the clean air goals or the climate goals that you have within your respective state. And certainly as a nation, this is a huge, huge priority for the federal government. But what does this mean in terms of our utilities? What does this mean for our industry partners that can be seeing where the markets are being prioritized so that they can plan their investments. So really thinking about how this strategy can be implemented across the board. And so as we have a number of government partners that are participating on today's webinar, want to encourage you to evaluate the strategy to see how this might support your investment planning on where we need to be deploying charging and hydrogen fueling infrastructure in critical areas within our zero-emission freight hubs, and certainly looking at the potential of how we're building out our zero-emission freight corridors over time. Next slide. So this is all about partnerships, right? And we're not starting from scratch. In fact, there is so much progress underway. There is so much for our industry to be proud of and around the US. What I wanted to share with this slide in particular is that our team worked with the White House to build off a very important day, our National Transport Day during Earth Week on April 24th, 2024. It was a huge opportunity for the Biden-Harris administration to, one, make a historic announcement around a zero-emission freight goal, but also to talk about a strategy to look at how to decarbonize the freight industry for truck, for rail, for maritime, for aviation, looking at our port operations. How are we going to move forward and how we're going to prioritize the decarbonization of our freight industry and making that a goal? And what's really important about this corridor strategy is it complements that. It takes that all of government approach in terms of making sure that all of our federal agencies are on board, also understanding that this is all a stakeholder approach as well, realizing that this brings value to all of our partners. On this important day, on National Transport Day, we brought together over 100 stakeholders that are working real time on deploying charging and hydrogen fueling projects throughout the US. And what was so interesting is that over 3 weeks, I think, Kevin, that we worked really hard to capture as much data as possible to reflect the momentum that we're seeing throughout the US. I think we collected about 171 projects around the US for both heavy duty charging and hydrogen refueling. And what we learned is that those projects that we identified within that small amount of time to be able to present and bring excitement and momentum around this important day focused on zero emission freight is that, in fact, where those projects are being deployed line up so nicely with what we're presenting in phase one. And you can see that in this slide here. We also wanted to show how we're already starting to see corridors being prioritized in the build out. So I feel like we are well underway with meeting the goals that we've outlined with phase one. And it's thanks to all the hard work of our stakeholders like you who are being a part of it. So if you're our infrastructure providers, if you're our fleets, if you're our metro planning organizations, if our environmental groups, various industry associations that are working together, our ports that are working together to help realize the deployment of needed infrastructure to help advance zero emission trucks. This was a great opportunity for us to highlight that momentum. And we want to continue doing that. This is an important aspect of saying, yes, this is happening. The momentum is here, but we need to continue it. We need to continue working with all of you to make sure that, one, we're improving upon and working over time to make this strategy even better, right? Making sure that we're filling the gaps, right? That we're seeing that there's opportunities to help move this industry at an accelerated pace so that we can meet our climate goals. I think in terms of next steps, we had a breakout session with 5 different groups during this important day for this White House roundtable. And we focused on the different elements of who are the different stakeholders that need to be at the table. How do we work with these different stakeholder groups to make sure that we're hearing all the voices that have a vested interest in advancing and building out an ecosystem for zero emission trucks? So we worked with environmental justice groups. We worked with the utilities. We worked with ports, the trucking sector, the infrastructure providers, the vehicle OEMs, the government, the local government, our community organizations to get their input on what is the best way that we can support the implementation of this strategy. And it's having a webinar like this, but what we've learned is regular convening, regular contact, making sure that we are participating in a conversation and we're regularly keeping in touch with all of you on what the needs are. So if we can go to the next step, or the next slide, which then presents the next steps on implementation. What we wanted to do, and we've been giving airtime to our strategy, we've been participating in a number of webinars, making sure that we're sharing this strategy with you, sharing how it can be implemented, how it can support our ability to move forward at an accelerated pace as an industry. And that's something that we're going to want to continue to do, is looking at how we can convene and how we can continue to engage. So expect to hear more from us on how we can support regions throughout the U.S. with implementation of this strategy. We realize that it's going to take collaboration with all of you to make this happen. And so understanding what your needs, what your priorities, how we can better improve our data is going to be really critical. So tracking our data, tracking real-time progress, being able to better anticipate where needs are so that we can be responsive to them and we can be preparing and planning for them. Then lastly, looking at making sure that, we're updating the strategy on an ongoing basis. As Kevin mentioned, this is a living document. This is a living process. This isn't perfect all at first glance. We know that over time, we're going to be able to work with you to make it a really imperative document that we're all walking in lockstep on so that we can really help realize this zero-emission transportation future that we want to see. And with that, I will turn it over to Bridget.
Yes. Thank you so much. I love that. I always feel like following Alicia, I want to do like 10 jumping jacks or something. Your energy is so infectious. I can invite everybody back up if you wouldn't mind. Thank you so much. And yeah, I think Ben said such a nice pulling it all together there, that there's so much going on the supply side, there's so much going on the demand side, there's work going on at EPA, at DOE, at DOT, and it's all really coming together so nicely. So really hats off to you all for all the great work that you've done to make this a reality. I'm going to sort through, I think we've got 13 questions that have come in so far, and I know a common one that we've received, I might hand off to Jean and to Kevin on how these maps might be available. Will there be files with the actual GIS data files that folks might be able to access in the future?
That's definitely the plan. Upon publication, we did not include GIS layers. What we wanted to make sure we did was take the time to only publish the one. So going through, cleaning up, making sure that everything that is published from a GIS perspective, because we know that that would be used directly in planning efforts. We want to make sure that it's clean, neat, and simple, and as usable as possible. So I won't speak for Jean, who's been tirelessly working on making sure that this is all as valuable and easy to implement as possible for our public and private sector stakeholders, but it's on our immediate term priorities list, and it's something that folks should expect to receive soon. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Jean, or correct anything that I've misstated.
No, I think, Kevin, that's perfect. We are working toward to be able to publish that as soon as possible.
Sounds good. And maybe on the topic of data, there's one that came in that was a little bit specific of thinking about the actual non-attainment metrics for air quality and other air pollutant measurements that came in. Can you speak to how these were used in this mapping a little bit more in depth, Jean? Thinking about those that maybe are hard to average over time, if they kind of cover large areas when you think about different pollutants. This person said that we're hearing from environmental justice partners that these different NAAQS non-attainment characterizations can miss some spots with really acute truck pollution, maybe in like more granular data.
Sure. So based on the feedback we got from EPA, that we include the non-attainment and maintenance area for particulate matter, PM 2.5 to PM 10, and also ozone in this in current strategy. That's the factor we are considering. So those are like enable those facilities that within those areas, the hubs within those areas will be prioritized in the early phases, as we mentioned. So we are definitely happy to get feedbacks on what other metrics or other data we should be considered for air quality concern, especially for targeting truck traffic. And so definitely happy to get feedbacks on the on that area, what other data we should be considering, other factors. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for speaking to that. Does anyone else want to weigh in on any of the next non-attainment layers?
Just to reiterate the piece that Jean spoke to, the extent to which there are other consistent data sets that we can leverage, we are all ears and looking forward to seeing how we can make this a more robust analysis. I think that was the baseline that we took, was how do we have as clear, consistent, and broadly applicable a set of publicly available data points for our deployment factors. So if there are alternatives that you think we can and should consider, those are the most useful and widely valued pieces of input. If there are other sort of metrics that we could be considering, that really helps us identify and evaluate alternative approaches for version 2.0.
Wonderful. Yeah, living, breathing document is what I'm hearing. There was one question that came in thinking about the role that electric utilities can play in the EV charging build out, especially thinking about maybe the loads that are needed for accommodating medium and heavy duty truck fleets, and thinking about those that might be hauling longer distances. I guess, how are utilities plugging into this work? Are they eligible to apply for this type of funding? Were they present at this roundtable? Maybe I can pass this off to you, Alicia.
Absolutely, and this is an excellent question. Yes, in fact, we did have utilities engaged during this roundtable, and I will say that we are doing a lot of work to evaluate the anticipated loads that we can expect as we see these markets developing and the demand that's going to be required to support the charging for heavy-duty vehicles. This is certainly something that's really critical to utilities as they're evaluating their current capacity and what they need to be planning for. And we realize, depending on the jurisdiction or where you are, that the needs and priorities are going to be different. So how can we best provide technical assistance, guidance in collaboration with our utilities to make sure that they're set up for success as they're working with the users who are needing and have that demand for that additional capacity to support their ability to deploy these vehicles. So yes, this is certainly, an important aspect of how we're collaborating with utilities, how we're, giving guidance, how we're supporting technical assistance, how we're evaluating needs, what does that need look like over time, how we're developing tools like EVs to scale, for example, to better inform utilities on where they can expect that demand to look like over time so that they can be planning accordingly. So yes, very good question. And that is something that is near and dear to our hearts in terms of making sure that our utilities are a key partner and we're working with them successfully.
And I'll add that the 7 corridor projects that I mentioned that are part of the VTO activities, those include utilities as critical stakeholders to work on those plans to identify where capacity is going to be needed, where capacity is available. So utilities are already involved implicitly because the 7 projects were used as part of our inputs.
Utilities are also critical stakeholders in the hydrogen hub as well.
Wonderful. Thank you all. I might keep Ben on to talk a little bit more about the hydrogen. I know that it seemed like the graph you had showing kind of the different use cases was very interesting. And I saw a question that had come on wondering a little bit more about the modeling. Was thinking about what kind of is the type of technology that's being modeled there. Is it currently available hydrogen fuel cell vehicles that are able to supply these different ranges? Are these types of battery electric vehicles already available? I think just kind of wondering what is already there, what might be coming in the future.
Okay, yeah, sure. I encourage you to check out the model presentation in detail at the AMR, but as a whole, we were sort of looking at, optimistic, forward-looking prices of hydrogen and electricity in terms of model inputs, and then we layered on top of that, so that bounds the TCO analysis. Then we took the actual data from VIAs that we have reported, the real-world data today, the most current of what vehicles are doing today. So that's layered on top of that techno-economic analysis. And then we took the announcements and what we've seen in terms of development in terms of vehicles in our programs and out in the literature and stitched that on top of it in terms of BEV vehicles and fuel cell electric vehicles. And that sort of third layer.
Wonderful. Yeah, always hard to talk about very in-depth modeling in just a short period of time.
I think the takeaway is You need both, and they need to both be supported in the corridor ecosystem, and that's exactly what the strategy shows.
Yeah, and just to add quickly, the intent was not to model one fuel type versus the other, or to create a zero-emission freight strategy for hydrogen or a zero-emission freight strategy for EVs. It's technology neutral as it relates to zero-emission fuel types. So the assumptions that we made about improvements over time are consistent with both. I think in general, with all technologies, we expect improvements over time. So I saw that the question, one of the questions that came up asked about, do we assume improvements in one versus the other? We considered that both would improve. And I think that beyond that, we did not prioritize hubs or corridors based on specific fuel types. It's really harkens back to what Jean walked us through, those deployment factors focusing on freight throughput, activity, the equity considerations, planning efforts on the ground, and economic implications for fleet operators.
I'll just echo what Kevin just said. You can see the deployment factor we are using are all technology neutral. We are not focusing on specific technology when we look into those deployment factors.
Nice. This might be a bit of a tough question that came in for Kevin. But while you're talking about the economic use cases, someone was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the business case for operators of charging centers on freight corridors. So I think thinking about maybe like that long haul or regional destination charging on the corridor and what that might look like.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's a really important question. And the good news is that there isn't just a one-size-fits-all approach. There's a million different ways in which transportation electrification and the provision of EV charging, whether on corridors or for regional and local fleets, is economically viable. So we know by other and related analyses that we've looked at is that if you look at the costs and you look at the utilization and you look at from cost from a capital and an operating side and you balance that against expected utilization, it's not a stretch to make this work. And that's why we're seeing historic investments from the private sector outside of public funding. Now, we know that there are challenges to bear, and that's why we've met with this strategy markets where they are now and to help accelerate them. So I think that there won't always be a location that will always work no matter what. You have to look at the site-specific considerations, but we wanted to make sure that this tool had enough flexibility to ensure that prioritizations didn't focus on specific pins in the map. They provided a wide range of geographic area to help prioritize where we expect utilization to be sufficient to maintain operations, so that when investments are prioritized and go in a specific region, that they have the highest chance of being successful without providing an overly precise level of specificity in terms of picking and choosing where everything has to be. So it's really a balance of how do we create focus based on our analysis while still leaving so much of that creativity analysis on the P&L side, and balancing costs and utilization across fleets and depot providers to the private sector. So it's truly a collaboration from the public and private sector, and we're seeing it happen in real time as folks apply to the Clean Ports program, the Clean Heavy Duty Vehicles program, and now as they start to develop applications for CFI Round 2. So it's not a tricky question. It's a really exciting question. And the long and short of it is it's hard to limit to the number of places where it could work, because it can work so many places.
Nice. That's great. I'm glad my characterization is wrong. I think, Alicia, you had mentioned this, but I do see a couple of questions talking a little bit more about maybe how this strategy works in terms of thinking about how these programs are incorporating prioritizing funding requests. I think some questions about kind of the timeline, like does it need to fit into phase 1 of this corridor strategy for these programs?
Excellent question and great framing. Thank you so much, Bridget. What I would say, and it's going to be based on whether it's federal or state program, the needs and timing of that statutory language of that funding program, right? So it may very well be that projects that are selected may be seeing the benefit of a phase 2 deployment, depending on the timing of that deployment, right? So understanding that the needs are going to be unique for each project and for each grant program. I think what's really important is that this aims to help orient and help focus where we need to be building over time, even if we're realizing that we may be seeing already deployments happening for phase 2, right? Which is what we want to see, right? Even from our roundtable, we were starting to witness, even from the projects that we were collecting, that we were already seeing progress against phase 2. So I think in terms of how one determines, how the strategy best fits with their prioritization for the investment really depends on their location and the unique needs of that region and what they're spelling out in terms of priorities of that grant program. I would say for the use of the strategy in general, it's a really nice way for states to have some level of guidance of, okay, this is the national kind of strategy on how the federal government has proposed we prioritize our planning, our investment and deployment of commercial zero emission vehicle infrastructure. What does that mean for my state? What does that mean for our region? How can I better collaborate with industry to better anticipate what their needs are? Where do we see technology evolving over time so that we can adapt that to that specific funding program? So hopefully this just is a great way of not only helping to prioritize investment, but help to inform how to approach taking that kind of zero emission fuel neutral approach to see what's best for that state, for that region. And just to quickly, I see another question on how might it be then evaluated for the federal government, state government can then use an opportunity to score projects by developing scoring criteria that may then, depending on the project, depending on its location, how it then falls within phase 1, phase 2, depending on what the timeline of that grant program is looking at, how that might support a ranking or a scoring to give a project more points because it's reflected within the goals of the strategy. So I could see that being an approach that a federal agency or a state agency might take to help them determine the projects they're going to score or select based on the criteria they evaluate for that supports and complements the National Zero Emission Freight Corridor strategy.
Wonderful. I think we might just have one more question that we have time for, just seeing that we're almost at the top of the hour. But thank you all so much for submitting so many wonderful questions today. I'm trying to see what would be a fun one to end with. There's one question that came in thinking about if there are any sort of programs that might be helpful to cover the costs of the grid upgrade. So the knowing the loads required for these medium heavy duty vehicles, do you all see any opportunities that might be good to highlight, thinking about how to support that electrical side of things, or where stakeholders could think to work to accommodate those costs?
That's a really good question. I will say that DOE has put in significant investments into grid upgrades. This does serve as a great opportunity for our team to be working with that office that might be managing and facilitating the deployment of those investments for grid upgrades to see how it aligns nicely with supporting the strategy approach that we're taking for transportation electrification. So excellent question. Yes, there are a lot of investments that are going toward grid upgrades. Great opportunity for this all of government approach to be looking at how we can be aligning with that investment program to better coordinate.
Yeah, that's a great point. A lot of all of government approaches going on all at the same time, doing our best to coordinate across. I just wanted to highlight a few resources that we wanted to make sure we make note of during today's presentation, just before we finish off today. So these slides, like I said, will be posted, and you can see the PDF and click all the nice hyperlinks that are included. So there's the strategy itself that's been discussed today. There's also a White House fact sheet that talks about this type of topic area as well. You can learn more about these funding opportunities that have been mentioned today, like the round 2 of CFI that's open at this time, the Clean Heavy Duty Vehicles Grant Program that was mentioned, and additionally learn more from the AMRs and all these wonderful other resources that have been mentioned today. The Joint Office, we also put out some fact sheets recently if you're interested about how hot and cold weather does impact these transit buses, but also applicable, I think, to electric vehicles in general. And these are some other wonderful resources coming out from the hydrogen side of things, some key publications. There's also hydrogen fuel cells day coming up on October 8th. So you can feel free to sign up for also learning about more on the fuel cell side of things, the newsletter. But just wanted to close out and say thank you all so much. This was a really wonderful way to spend an hour. And I think that this work has been just the perfect way of showcasing, we are trying to work together. That is what, Joint Office, we're trying to work together. I think everyone across the federal government really sees this as a wonderful time to think collaboratively and pull all of these great programs together cohesively. So thanks so much. We really appreciate it, and hope to see you in another webinar soon.